He dies at 32 in a palace built by someone else, in a city that will forget his name for centuries. The empire he carved from 3 continents fractures before his body cools. His generals will spend 50 years killing each other over the pieces. But none of that matters yet. What matters is the pattern, the way a single human being, given enough will and enough violence, can rewrite the shape of the known world. Alexander of Macedon did not invent conquest. He perfected it. He made it inevitable. This is not a story about a hero. It is a story about momentum. There are moments when history pivots on the decision of one person. Alexander understood this instinctively. He did not hesitate. He did not reconsider. From the age of 20 until the day he collapsed in Babylon, he moved forward. Every pause was temporary. Every victory demanded another. The machine he built required constant feeding, and the only fuel it accepted was territory. He crossed into Asia with 35,000 soldiers and a treasury so empty he had to borrow money to fund the invasion. 10 years later, he controlled everything from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River. No one in recorded history had done this. No one had even tried. But the cost was absolute. The men who followed him into Persia were not the men who refused to march farther in India. The generals who celebrated at Gaugamela were not the same generals he executed in Bactria. The young king who wept at Achilles' tomb was not the man who burned Persepolis and wore the robes of a Persian emperor. Something changed. Or perhaps nothing changed, and the world simply saw him more clearly. Alexander believed he was descended from Achilles and Heracles. He carried a copy of the Iliad everywhere, annotated by Aristotle himself. He slept with it under his pillow alongside a dagger. The choice of objects is telling. The poem and the blade, the myth and the method. He read about Troy and decided he would surpass it. He studied the campaigns of his father and decided he would eclipse them. He looked at the Persian Empire, the largest, wealthiest, most administratively sophisticated state on earth, and decided it belonged to him. And then he took it. This is not mythology. This happened. A Macedonian king, barely old enough to grow a full beard, dismantled a 200-year-old superpower in less than a decade. He fought in the front lines. He took wounds that should have killed him. He kept moving. The question historians argue about is not whether Alexander was great. The question is what greatness means when it leaves a trail of corpses from the Balkans to the Hindu Kush. He destroyed cities that resisted him. He sold populations into slavery. He executed men who had served him for years on the thinnest pretexts. He demanded worship as a living god, and killed anyone who laughed. He also founded cities that would outlast his empire. He spread Greek language and culture across 3 continents. He married Persian nobility and forced his generals to do the same. He tried, in his chaotic and violent way, to fuse East and West into something new. Both versions are true. History does not require moral simplicity. What history does require is documentation. And the problem with Alexander is that nearly everything written about him was composed centuries after his death. The earliest surviving account comes from a Roman historian writing 400 years later, stitching together fragments of lost biographies, campaign journals, and court propaganda. We know what happened. We do not always know why. We know he invaded Persia. We do not know if he planned to conquer the entire empire or simply wanted revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier. We know he burned Persepolis. We do not know if it was strategic, symbolic, or drunken impulse. We know his army refused to continue in India. We do not know exactly what broke their loyalty: exhaustion, fear, or the realization that Alexander would never stop. What we do know is the shape of his life, the speed of it, the relentlessness. He became king at 20 after his father was assassinated at a wedding. Within 2 years, he had crushed rebellions in Greece, Thrace, and Illyria. Within 3, he had crossed into Asia. Within 6, he controlled Egypt. Within 10, he stood on the banks of the Bias River in India, farther east than any Mediterranean army had ever marched, staring at his soldiers and realizing they would not follow him any more. And then he turned back, not because he wanted to, because he had no choice. This is the part that matters. Alexander did not lose a battle. He ran out of men willing to fight them. The empire he built was not designed to last. It was designed to expand. When expansion stopped, the structure collapsed. His death simply accelerated what was already inevitable. But the pattern remained. Every conqueror who came after him, Julius Caesar, Trajan, Genghis, Khan, Napoleon, studied Alexander. They learned his tactics. They absorbed his ambition. They repeated his mistakes. They all believed they were different. They all believed they could sustain what he could not. They were all wrong. This is the story of how one man rewrote the map of the ancient world and then died before he could finish the sentence. It is a story about what happens when willpower meets geography, when ambition collides with human limits, when a king decides that stopping is the same as failing. It is the story of Alexander, and it starts long before he was born. Macedonia was not Greece. The Greeks made sure everyone knew this. To the city-states of Athens, Thebes, and Sparta, the Macedonians were half-barbarian northerners who spoke a bastardized dialect, worshipped the wrong gods in the wrong ways, and had not produced a single philosopher worth remembering. They lived in the mountains. They drank wine unmixed with water. Their kings ruled like warlords, not statesmen. The Macedonians did not particularly care what the Greeks thought. They had other problems. The kingdom sat at the crossroads of the Balkans, surrounded by hostile tribes, Illyrians to the west, Thracians to the east, Paeonians to the north. Raids were constant. Survival required military excellence. Macedonian boys learned to ride and fight before they learned to read. The nobility measured status in land, horses, and combat reputation. This was the world Philip II inherited in 359 BCE, and it was collapsing. His brother, the previous king, had just been killed in battle along with 4,000 Macedonian soldiers. Illyrian armies were pushing into the western highlands. Thracian warlords threatened the eastern borders. Athens backed a rival claimant to the throne. The kingdom was days away from disintegration. Philip was 23 years old. He had spent his adolescence as a political hostage in Thebes, studying their military innovations while his family navigated assassination plots and civil wars back home. He returned to a kingdom that had no functional army, no treasury, and no time. Within 2 years, he had rebuilt both. He introduced the sarissa, a 16-foot pike that turned infantry into an impenetrable wall of spear points. He expanded the cavalry into a hammer force designed to shatter enemy lines. He trained his soldiers year-round, paid them in land and plunder, and gave them an identity. They were Macedonians, and they were unbeatable. Then he proved it. He defeated the Illyrians. He subdued the Paeonians. He seized control of the gold and silver mines in the Pangaian hills, which gave him the wealth to fund a permanent professional army. He fortified the borders, crushed internal rivals, and turned a collapsing frontier kingdom into a regional power. And he did it through war. Constant, methodical, unrelenting war. By the time Alexander was born in 356 BCE, Macedonia was no longer on the defensive. It was expanding. Philip's army had become the most effective military force in the Greek world. His court had become a center of strategic innovation. His ambitions had shifted from survival to dominance. The boy who would inherit this machine arrived during a thunderstorm, though the sources differ on whether this is symbolism or weather. His mother was Olympias, a princess from Epirus known for her intensity, her devotion to ecstatic religious cults, and her absolute conviction that her son was destined for greatness. She told Alexander he was descended from Achilles, through her bloodline, and from Heracles through Philip's. She told him the gods had marked him. She told him he was not like other children. She was right, though not in the way she imagined. Alexander grew up in a palace where violence was policy. He watched his father marry 7 times for political alliances. He watched rivals disappear. He watched his mother and father wage a cold war of influence, manipulation, and rage. He learned that power was not inherited. It was taken, held, and defended. He also learned that his father was transforming the Greek world. Philip's strategy was elegant and brutal. He would conquer a city, install a garrison, and then offer the defeated population a choice: join the Macedonian alliance or be destroyed. Most joined. Those who resisted became examples. By the time Alexander was 10, Philip controlled most of northern Greece. By the time he was 12, Macedonian influence reached Thessaly and Thrace. By the time he was 14, Athens and Thebes were discussing whether to unite against the Macedonian threat or negotiate. Philip chose the timing. He forced the issue at Chaeronea in 338 BCE. Alexander was 18. His father gave him command of the cavalry. The battle was a masterpiece of coordinated violence. The Macedonian phalanx pinned the Greek center. Philip feigned retreat, drawing the enemy forward. Alexander led the companion cavalry in a flanking charge that shattered the Theban sacred band, an elite unit that had never been defeated. When the dust settled, the sacred band was annihilated. Greek independence was finished. Philip stood as the hegemon of Greece, and Alexander had his first taste of what he was capable of. The sources describe him as physically striking, shorter than average but powerfully built, with pale skin, one eye darker than the other, and hair that fell across his forehead in a way later artists would immortalize. He moved quickly. He spoke quickly. He absorbed information and made decisions faster than the people around him. He was also volatile. He had inherited his mother's intensity and his father's ruthlessness, but without the patience that had made Philip effective. Alexander did not think in terms of incremental gains. He thought in terms of totality. This would define his reign. But first, he had to survive his father's court. Philip's court was a viper's nest of competing factions, ambitious generals, and royal family dysfunction. Olympias despised Philip's other wives. Philip's generals jockeyed for position. Succession was not guaranteed. Philip had other sons, and Macedonian tradition did not require the eldest to inherit. Alexander had to prove himself indispensable. He had to be the son Philip could not ignore. He did this by becoming the only person in the kingdom who could match Philip's vision. While other princes drank and hunted, Alexander studied. While they celebrated victories, Alexander analyzed them. He did not, simply want to inherit his father's kingdom. He wanted to surpass it, and he had a teacher who believed he could. Philip had hired the best mind in the Greek world to tutor his son, a philosopher from Stagira who had studied under Plato, who had dissected animals to understand biology, who believed knowledge could be systematized and taught. His name was Aristotle, and for 3 years he and Alexander discussed everything from ethics to zoology, from the nature of kingship to the structure of the cosmos. Those conversations shaped the man who would conquer Persia, but they did not predict him. No one could have predicted Alexander, not even Alexander himself. Philip of Macedon understood something his contemporaries did not. War was not about courage. It was about systems. The Greek city-states fielded militias. Farmers and merchants who trained a few weeks a year, fought in the summer, and went home at harvest. Battles were brutal, short, and decided by whoever could hold the phalanx formation longer. The warriors were brave. The system was inefficient. Philip built a professional army. Soldiers who trained year-round, who were paid in land and loyalty, who saw war as a career rather than a civic duty. He gave them equipment that turned individual bravery into collective force. The Sarissa phalanx was not about heroism. It was about discipline, endurance, and the mechanical application of violence. It worked. It kept working. And Philip never stopped refining it. He studied siege warfare and imported engineers from Greece to build torsion catapults and siege towers. He studied logistics and created supply lines that allowed his army to campaign through winter. He studied diplomacy and realized that bribery was often cheaper than battle. His enemies called him cunning. His soldiers called him effective. His son called him the standard to surpass. The relationship between Philip and Alexander was complicated in the way royal families are always complicated. There was pride. There was competition. There was the unspoken understanding that only one of them could rule, and succession in Macedonia was never guaranteed. Philip loved Alexander, probably. He also hedged his bets. He married constantly, each marriage a new alliance. Each new wife brought the possibility of another son. Olympias watched this with fury. Alexander watched it with calculation. The message was clear. Prove yourself indispensable or be replaced. Alexander proved himself at Chaeronea. He commanded the cavalry that broke the Greek line. He showed not just courage but tactical intelligence, timing the charge perfectly to exploit the gap his father's feint had created. It was a performance designed to demonstrate competence. Philip noticed. So did the rest of the court. But proving competence was not the same as securing succession. Philip had unified Greece, but his next target was larger, the Persian Empire. He had already sent an advance force across the Hellespont. He was planning the full invasion, and the question everyone whispered was whether he would take Alexander with him, or leave him behind to prevent a coup. The answer became irrelevant in 336 BCE. Philip was attending a wedding, one of the endless dynastic marriages that held his alliances together. The ceremony was in Aegae, the old Macedonian capital. Philip entered the theater unarmed, flanked by his son and his son-in-law, a display of confidence and family unity. A man named Pausanias, a member of Philip's bodyguard, stepped forward and stabbed him in the chest. Philip died immediately. Pausanias ran. He was caught and killed before he could be questioned. The motives remain disputed. Some sources say it was personal. Pausanias had been assaulted, and Philip had ignored his appeals for justice. Other sources suggest conspiracy. though naming the conspirators depends on which account you trust. Olympias was suspected. Alexander was suspected. Philip's other wives and their families were suspected. The truth disappeared with Pausanias. What did not disappear was the crisis. Macedonia had a dead king, a kingdom on the edge of war with Persia and multiple potential heirs. The army could have fractured. The nobility could have turned on each other. Greece could have rebelled. Instead, Alexander moved faster than anyone could react. He secured the support of the key generals within hours. He executed potential rivals within days. He appeared before the Macedonian assembly, an ancient tradition where the army confirmed the new king, and was acclaimed before anyone else could organize opposition. He was 20 years old. He had just inherited the most powerful military in the Mediterranean and a planned invasion of the largest empire on earth. The smart play would have been consolidation. Secure the throne. Let Greece settle. Build legitimacy before attempting anything ambitious. Alexander did the opposite. He immediately marched north to crush tribal rebellions in Thrace and Illyria. Not because they were existential threats, but because he needed to prove he was not Philip's shadow. He needed the army to see him as a commander, not just an heir. The campaign was brutal and effective. He fought in the front lines, took risks that terrified his generals, and won. The Thracians surrendered. The Illyrians retreated. And the Macedonian army, which had wondered if this boy could replace Philip, began to believe. But Greece was not convinced. Thebes revolted. The city had been garrisoned by Philip, forced into the Macedonian alliance, and humiliated at Chaeronea. With Philip dead and Alexander distracted, in the north they saw an opportunity. They killed the Macedonian garrison and declared independence. Other Greek cities watched. If Thebes succeeded, the alliance would collapse. If Alexander failed to respond, his authority would evaporate. He did not fail to respond. Alexander's force marched his army south, covering hundreds of miles in less than 2 weeks. He arrived outside Thebes before the city had finished reinforcing its walls. He offered terms: surrender, and he would be merciful. Thebes refused. Alexander did not besiege the city. He did not negotiate. He assaulted it directly, breached the walls, and let his soldiers sack it completely. 30,000 Thebans were sold into slavery. The city was razed. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. It was deliberate. It was calculated. It was meant to send a message to every city in Greece. Resistance is annihilation. The message was received. Athens sent ambassadors to apologize for even considering rebellion. Sparta stayed quiet. The rest of Greece reaffirmed their loyalty. Alexander had done in 2 months what might have taken another king 2 years. He had crushed internal enemies, secured his borders, and terrorized Greece into submission. He had inherited his father's war machine and proven he knew how to use it. Now he had a choice. He could rule Greece. He could consolidate his father's gains. He could be a successful king. Or he could do what Philip had planned and invade Persia. Alexander did not hesitate. The invasion had always been inevitable. His father had built the weapon. Alexander would fire it. But first, he needed to understand what he was aiming at. For 3 years, in a secluded sanctuary near the town of Mieza, Alexander studied under Aristotle. He was 13 when the lessons began. By the time they ended, he had absorbed a worldview that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. Aristotle had been hired by Philip to tutor the prince and a small group of Macedonian nobles. sons of the elite who would become Alexander's generals. The philosopher was 41, already famous for his work on logic, biology, and ethics. He had studied under Plato in Athens, but had rejected his teacher's mystical idealism in favor of something harder: observation, categorization, evidence. He taught Alexander to think systematically, to break problems into components, to analyze cause and effect, to understand that knowledge was not received wisdom but something you built through inquiry. The curriculum was vast: rhetoric and poetry, medicine and biology, politics and ethics, the nature of virtue, the structure of government, the relationship between the individual and the state. They read Homer, always Homer, but they also dissected animals, studied maps, and discussed the differences between Greek and barbarian cultures. That last part mattered. Aristotle believed in Greek superiority, not as propaganda, but as philosophy. Greeks, he argued, were naturally suited to freedom and reason. Barbarians, Persians, Egyptians, Scythians were naturally suited to despotism. This was not cruelty. This was the natural order. Alexander absorbed this. He believed in Greek excellence. He believed in the civilizing mission of Hellenic culture. But he also saw something Aristotle did not. The Persians had built an empire that had lasted 2 centuries. They had administrative systems, architectural wonders, and military traditions that predated Greek history. Dismissing them as barbarians was satisfying but not strategic. He would later try to fuse Greek and Persian culture, marrying Persian nobility and adopting Persian dress. This horrified the Macedonian old guard and confused the Greeks. Aristotle would have disapproved. But by then, Alexander had moved beyond his teacher. The education was not just intellectual. Aristotle taught Alexander to value knowledge as a tool. When Alexander invaded Persia, he brought surveyors, botanists, and historians. When he reached India, he collected plant samples and interrogated local scholars. He wanted to know how the world worked. He wanted to catalog it. This was not philosophy for its own sake. It was empire building through understanding. If you knew the terrain, the crops, the local power structures, you could rule more effectively. Knowledge was leverage. But the most important thing Aristotle gave Alexander was not a fact or a method. It was permission. Aristotle taught that great men, men of exceptional virtue and ability, were not bound by the same rules as ordinary people. The best should rule. The strong should lead. Excellence justified authority. Alexander heard this and understood it as a description of himself. He was faster, smarter, braver than the people around him. He outworked his companions. He took risks they would not take. He saw opportunities they missed. By Aristotle's logic, he deserved to rule. Not because of his bloodline, though that helped, but because he was exceptional. This belief became the engine of his reign. He did not conquer Persia because Macedonia needed territory. He conquered it because he believed he was supposed to, because men like him were supposed to reshape the world. It was a seductive idea. It was also dangerous. The lessons at Gaza ended when Alexander turned 16. Philip recalled him to court and gave him authority to govern Macedonia while the king campaigned. It was a test. Alexander passed it, crushing a local revolt and founding his first city. He never saw Aristotle regularly again. They exchanged letters. They remained respectful. But their paths diverged. Aristotle returned to Athens and founded the Lyceum. Alexander went to war. The philosopher lived another 13 years after Alexander's death. He never wrote about his former students' conquests. Perhaps he disapproved. Perhaps he recognized that Alexander had become something Aristotle's categories could not contain, a man who treated the world as a problem to be solved through force and will. But the influence remained. Alexander carried a copy of the Iliad that Aristotle had annotated for him. He kept it in a jeweled casket taken from the Persian royal treasury. Every night it lay beside his dagger, the poem and the blade, the education and the violence. Aristotle had taught him to think. Philip had taught him to fight. Olympias had taught him to believe in his destiny. The combination was unstoppable. It was also unsustainable. Because the worldview Alexander inherited, Greek exceptionalism, the right of the superior to rule, the belief that conquest was civilizing, worked perfectly until it encountered limits, until the soldiers were exhausted, until the conquered populations resisted, until the empire became too large to govern. Aristotle had taught Alexander how to conquer. He had not taught him how to stop. And Alexander never learned. The throne was not waiting for Alexander. He had to kill for it. Philip's assassination created a vacuum, and vacuums in Macedonian politics filled with violence. The kingdom had no clear succession law. The army decided who ruled, and the army could be persuaded. Philip had multiple sons from multiple marriages. Alexander was the most competent, but competence was not always enough. He moved immediately. While others were still processing the shock, Alexander secured the backing of Antipater and Parmenion, two of Philip's most powerful generals. With their support, he appeared before the Macedonian assembly and was acclaimed king. The speed of it prevented opposition from organizing. But acclamation was not security. There were rivals. Amyntas, son of Philip's older brother, had a legitimate claim. Attalus, the uncle of Philip's last wife, commanded part of the army in Asia and was rumored to oppose Alexander. There were nobles who had backed other candidates, factions loyal to other wives, generals who resented taking orders from a 20-year-old. Alexander dealt with them methodically. Amyntas was executed for conspiracy. Whether he actually conspired is unclear. What is clear is that Alexander could not afford a rival claimant. Attalus was declared a traitor and assassinated. The purge extended to anyone who might destabilize the succession. Some were killed, others were exiled. The court learned quickly that opposition to Alexander was fatal. Olympias helped. She had her own rivals eliminated, including Philip's last wife and her infant daughter. The sources disagree on whether Alexander ordered this or merely allowed it. The distinction hardly mattered. The message was the same. The succession was settled, and dissent would not be tolerated. It was brutal. It was necessary. It was Macedonian politics. With the internal threats neutralized, Alexander faced external ones. The tribes to the north, Illyrians, Thracians, Tribalians, had been subdued by Philip but never fully pacified. They saw the transition of power as an opportunity to raid, rebel, or assert independence. Alexander marched north with an army in the spring of 335 BCE. The campaign was a demonstration of speed and violence. He caught the Thracians off guard, crushed their resistance, and pushed into Illyria. The Illyrian king fled. The tribes sued for peace. But while Alexander was in the north, a rumor spread. The young king was dead, killed in battle against the barbarians. Greece erupted. Thebes declared independence. Athens debated whether to join the revolt. Other cities waited to see if the rumor was true. If Alexander was dead, the Macedonian hegemony would collapse. Greek freedom could be restored. The rumor was false. Alexander was not dead. He was marching south. He covered the distance from Illyria to Thebes in 13 days, a logistical feat that shocked everyone who heard about it. He arrived with an army before Thebes had time to prepare. He surrounded the city and offered terms. Surrender, and he would be merciful. Resist, and the consequences would be absolute. Thebes chose resistance. It was a proud city. It had produced poets and warriors. It had defeated Sparta. It would not bow to a Macedonian boy king. Alexander assaulted the walls. His forces breached the defenses and poured into the city. What followed was systematic destruction. The Macedonian soldiers, angry at the rebellion and eager for plunder, sacked Thebes completely. 30,000 people were enslaved. The city was leveled. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar remained. It was not rage. It was policy. Alexander wanted every city in Greece to understand what rebellion cost. He wanted fear to replace defiance. He wanted submission without having to fight for it every year. It worked. Athens sent envoys to apologize for even discussing rebellion. Sparta stayed silent. The rest of Greece reaffirmed their loyalty to the Macedonian-led Hellenic League. Alexander had secured his kingdom in less than 2 years. He had crushed internal rivals, subdued the northern tribes, and terrorized Greece into compliance. He had proven that he was not his father's inferior. He had proven that he was, if anything, more ruthless. Now he turned his attention to Persia. The invasion had been Philip's plan. The groundwork was already in place. An advance force was in Asia Minor, testing Persian defenses. The justification was ready. Revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier. The army was trained, equipped, and hungry for plunder. But the decision to actually go, to commit to a war of conquest against the largest empire on earth, was Alexander's. His advisors were divided. Some argued for consolidation, secure Greece, build up the treasury, wait until the kingdom was unquestionably stable. Others pointed out that the Persian Empire was vast, wealthy, and experienced at suppressing rebellions. Darius III, the current Persian king, commanded resources that dwarfed Macedonia. Alexander ignored all of it. He did not think in terms of risk management. He thought in terms of destiny. He had been raised on stories of Achilles and Heracles. He had been taught by Aristotle that exceptional men deserved exceptional lives. He had watched his father conquer Greece and planned to surpass him. Invading Persia was not a choice. It was the logical next step. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with 35,000 soldiers and a treasury so depleted he had borrowed money to fund the expedition. He left Antipater in charge of Macedonia and Greece with 12,000 troops. Everything else came with him. He stopped at Troy and made sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles. He took armor from the temple that was said to have belonged to heroes of the Trojan War. He announced that he was following in the footsteps of the greatest warriors in Greek mythology. It was theater, but it was also belief. Alexander thought he was destined to surpass every conqueror who had come before him. And for the next 10 years, he would prove it. Greece never forgave Alexander for Thebes. They submitted to him. They fought in his armies. They benefited from his victories. But they never forgave him. The destruction of Thebes was not a military necessity. It was a message. Alexander had chosen one of the great cities of Greece, a city that had stood for centuries, a city that had given the world Pindar and Epaminondas, and erased it. He had turned culture, history, and pride into rubble and slaves. The other Greek cities understood. Rebellion was not a political calculation. It was a death sentence. Athens had flirted with supporting Thebes. Demosthenes, the great orator, had argued passionately for Greek unity against Macedonian domination. When news of Thebes's destruction reached Athens, Demosthenes went silent. The city sent ambassadors to Alexander begging for forgiveness, for even considering resistance. Alexander granted it. Not out of mercy, but out of calculation. Athens was still the cultural heart of Greece. Destroying it would have turned him into a tyrant in the eyes of the Greek world. He needed Greece compliant, not obliterated. But he made Athens pay in other ways. He demanded the handover of political opponents. He required tribute. He made it clear that Athenian autonomy existed only because he allowed it. Sparta refused to join the Hellenic League entirely. They had not fought at Chaeronea. They did not recognize Macedonian authority. They maintained their independence through sheer stubbornness and the implicit threat that conquering them would cost more than it was worth. Alexander let them be. For now, Sparta was a shadow of its former power. It controlled a fraction of the Peloponnese. It posed no real threat. And Alexander had larger ambitions than forcing an aging warrior culture into submission. He wanted Persia, but to invade Persia he needed Greece stable. He needed soldiers, supplies, and legitimacy. The Hellenic League provided all three. Philip had created the League after Chaeronea, a coalition of Greek states nominally independent but functionally controlled by Macedonia. Alexander inherited it and used it brilliantly. The invasion of Persia was framed not as Macedonian conquest, but as Greek revenge. The justification was old. Persia had invaded Greece in 490 and 480 BCE. They had burned Athens. They had desecrated Greek temples. The invasion was payback. It was justice. It was Panhellenism in action. None of this was true in any meaningful sense. The Persian invasions were a century and a half in the past. Most Greeks did not care about avenging ancient grievances. The invasion was about Alexander's ambition, not Greek solidarity. But the framing worked. It gave Greek soldiers a reason to fight. It gave Greek cities a reason to contribute. It allowed Alexander to present himself as the leader of a civilizing mission rather than a conqueror. And it made opposition to Alexander seem like betrayal of Greece itself. The Greek soldiers who marched with Alexander into Asia were not fools. They knew they were serving Macedonian interests, but they also knew that service came with opportunities, plunder, land, glory, and they knew that refusal came with consequences. Thebes had made that clear. The destruction lingered in Greek memory like a scar. Later, historians would debate whether Alexander regretted it. Some sources claim he expressed remorse. Others say he never mentioned it again. The truth is unknowable and perhaps irrelevant. What mattered was the effect. Greece was subdued not through loyalty but through fear. Cities obeyed because resistance meant annihilation. Soldiers fought because advancement required proximity to power. The Hellenic League functioned because Alexander made dissent impossible. This was not the Greece of Pericles or Socrates. This was Greece as a subject state, its independence traded for survival, its culture harnessed to fuel Macedonian conquest. And the Greeks hated it, even as they benefited. even as Greek language and culture spread across Asia in Alexander's wake. Even as Greek merchants grew wealthy on the trade routes Alexander's conquests opened. They hated it because Alexander had proven that Greek ideals, democracy, autonomy, civic virtue, meant nothing when confronted with overwhelming force. Athens had been the birthplace of philosophy and drama. Thebes had been a military power that rivaled Sparta. None of it mattered. Macedonia had better soldiers and a king willing to use them without hesitation. The lesson was clear. Culture does not stop armies. Walls do not stop ambition. The only thing that mattered was power, and Alexander had it. So Greece submitted. They sent soldiers. They sent money. They sent engineers and administrators and scholars. They participated in the invasion of Persia because they had no choice and because, for some, the opportunities outweighed the humiliation. But they never forgot that Alexander had made them do it. They never forgot Thebes. When Alexander died in Babylon 12 years later, Greece erupted in rebellion within weeks. They called it the Lamian War. They tried to reclaim their independence. They failed. Antipater crushed them, but the speed of the revolt tells you everything you need to know. Greece had been waiting for Alexander to die. They had obeyed him because they feared him. The moment he was gone, they tried to break free. But in 334 BCE, as Alexander prepared to cross into Asia, none of that had happened yet. Greece was stable. The Hellenic League was functional. The army was ready. Alexander stood at the edge of the known world with an invasion force and a justification. He had subdued his kingdom. He had crushed rebellion. He had secured his rear. Now he had to win. The Hellespont is less than a mile wide at its narrowest point. On one side, Europe, Macedonia, Greece, everything Alexander had conquered and controlled. On the other, Asia, Persia, the largest empire the world had ever seen. Alexander crossed in the spring of 334 BCE with 35,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and almost no money. His treasury was nearly empty. He had borrowed funds to equip the expedition. His chief treasurer later claimed Alexander left Macedonia with only 70 talents and debts worth 200 more. It was insane. You do not invade a superpower on credit. Alexander did it anyway. He personally steered the lead ship across the strait. Halfway across, he sacrificed a bull to Poseidon and poured libations to the sea gods. When the ship reached the Asian shore, he threw a spear into the sand and claimed the continent as Spear One territory. It was theater. It was also intent. Alexander was announcing that Asia belonged to him by right of conquest, even though he had not conquered anything yet. The assumption of victory was baked into the gesture. From the beach he rode to Troy. The city was ruins. The Trojan War, if it had happened at all, was 1,000 years in the past. But the mythology was alive, and Alexander treated it as prophecy. He made sacrifices at the temple of Athena. He took a shield said to have belonged to Achilles and exchanged it for his own. He ran naked around Achilles' tomb with his companions, honoring his ancestor. The symbolism was deliberate. Achilles had come to Asia and won glory. Alexander would do the same, but larger. Achilles had fought for 10 years over a city. Alexander would fight for an empire. The Persians were waiting. The local satraps, provincial governors, had gathered an army near the Granicus River, about 50 miles from where Alexander landed. The force was not enormous, perhaps 20,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. But it included Greek, mercenaries, experienced soldiers who knew how to fight Macedonian phalanxes, and Persian noble cavalry, among the finest mounted warriors in the world. The Persian strategy was defensive. They positioned themselves on the far side of the river, on high ground, and dared Alexander to attack. Crossing a river under fire, uphill, against a prepared enemy was suicidal. The Persians expected Alexander to look for a better position or wait for reinforcements. Alexander attacked immediately. His senior general, Parmenion, argued for delay. The river was too deep. The banks were too steep. They would be slaughtered trying to climb out of the water. Wait until morning. Find a ford. Do not waste the army on the first engagement. Alexander ignored him. He could not afford delay. His treasury was empty. His army needed plunder to stay motivated. His legitimacy depended on momentum. If he hesitated, the Persians would reinforce, and the entire campaign would stall. He ordered the cavalry forward. The companion cavalry plunged into the river with Alexander at the front. The current was strong. The horses struggled. Persian arrows and javelins rained down. Macedonian soldiers drowned or were cut down as they climbed the muddy banks. Alexander reached the far side. A Persian nobleman struck him in the head with an axe, cracking his helmet. Another Persian raised a sword to finish him. Clytus, one of Alexander's bodyguards, killed the man before the blow landed. It was chaos, it was desperation, and then it was victory. The Macedonian cavalry forced their way up the bank and broke the Persian line. The phalanx crossed behind them and pressed the advantage. The Persian cavalry retreated. The Greek mercenaries tried to hold, but they were surrounded and slaughtered. Alexander gave no quarter. The mercenaries were Greeks fighting for Persia. They were traitors. He had 2,000 of them executed, and sent the rest back to Macedonia in chains. The Battle of Granicus was not large by ancient standards. The numbers were modest. The stakes were regional. But the psychological impact was enormous. Alexander had crossed into Asia and won his first battle against the Persian Empire. He had fought in the front lines and survived. He had proven that Persian forces could be beaten. The western satrapies panicked. Some garrisoned their cities, others fled. A few surrendered without resistance. Alexander moved fast. He marched down the coast, liberating Greek cities from Persian control. He presented himself as a liberator, not a conqueror. He abolished tribute payments to Persia. He installed democratic governments. He framed the campaign as the revenge of Greece against barbarian oppression. Some cities believed him. Some played along because they had no choice. Some resisted. Miletus resisted. Alexander besieged it, took it, and sold the population into slavery. Halicarnassus resisted. Alexander besieged it for months, finally taking it through relentless assault. The pattern repeated. Surrender and be welcomed. Resist and be destroyed. By the end of the year, Alexander controlled the western coast of Asia Minor. He had secured ports, denied the Persian navy bases, and established himself as a serious threat. But he had not yet faced the full weight of the Persian Empire. That would come. Darius III, the Persian king, had not taken Alexander seriously at first. The Granicus had been a regional skirmish, handled by local governors. But as reports came in, cities falling, armies scattering, the Macedonian advance continuing, Darius began to understand. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. He began assembling the imperial army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers from across the empire, Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, Egyptians. the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen. Alexander had won his first victories. He had momentum. He had confidence. But he was still 35,000 soldiers in a hostile continent. 1,000 miles from home, with no resupply, no reinforcements, and an empire preparing to crush him. The smart move would have been to consolidate, fortify the coast, wait for the Persian response and defend what he had taken. Alexander did not consolidate. He marched inland into the heart of Anatolia, toward the Persian royal road, toward the armies gathering to stop him. He had crossed the Hellespont with a spear and a prayer. Now he had to prove it was enough. Darius III inherited an empire in decline and did not realize it until Alexander invaded. The Persian Empire had existed for 2 centuries. It stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River, from the Caucasus Mountains to the deserts of Arabia. It governed dozens of cultures, languages, and religions through a bureaucratic system that was, for its time, astonishingly sophisticated. Satraps ruled the provinces with local autonomy as long as they paid tribute and provided troops when required. A royal road connected the major cities, allowing messages to travel thousands of miles in weeks. The empire maintained a professional army, a navy, and a treasury, fed by the wealth of Babylon, Egypt, and the trade routes of Central Asia. It was, by any measure, the most powerful state on earth, but it was also fragile. The empire had been stable under strong kings, Cyrus, Darius I, Xerxes. But succession struggles, court intrigues, and regional revolts had weakened central authority. Egypt had rebelled multiple times. Satraps had grown semi-independent. The imperial army, once the terror of the known world, had become dependent on Greek mercenaries to provide discipline and tactical innovation. Darius III had come to power through a palace coup in 336 BCE. He was not incompetent. He was brave, personally. He was willing to lead from the front. But he was not a military genius, and he had inherited a system that assumed Persian superiority without having to prove it. Then Alexander arrived, and assumptions started to collapse. The loss at Granicus was not catastrophic in strategic terms. The Persian Empire could lose armies and raise new ones. What mattered was momentum. Alexander had crossed into Asia and won. He had liberated Greek cities and presented himself as a champion of freedom. He had captured Persian treasuries and used the plunder to pay his soldiers. He was moving too fast. Darius sent orders to the western satraps. Stop him, whatever it takes. The satraps tried. They assembled armies. They fortified cities. They employed scorched earth tactics, burning crops and evacuating populations to deny Alexander supplies. It did not work. Alexander kept winning. He adapted to every strategy the Persians employed. When they fortified cities, he besieged them. When they avoided battle, he forced engagements. When they tried to outlast him, he lived off plunder and local tribute. By 333 BCE, it was clear the regional forces could not contain him. Darius would have to face Alexander personally. The Persian king assembled an army. Estimates vary wildly. Ancient sources claim anywhere from 200,000 to 600,000 soldiers. Modern historians suggest the real number was closer to 80 or 100,000. Even the conservative estimates made it the largest force Darius could field. It included the immortals, the elite Persian infantry. It included cavalry from across the empire. Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Scythians. It included Greek mercenaries, experienced soldiers who had fought in countless campaigns. It included war chariots designed to break infantry formations. It was a professional army, well supplied and confident. Darius marched west to intercept Alexander. The two forces met near the town of Issus on the narrow coastal plain between the mountains and the sea. The terrain was a disaster for Darius. He had superior numbers, but the narrow plain compressed his forces, negating the numerical advantage. He could not outflank Alexander. He could not maneuver. His army was forced into a narrow front where Macedonian discipline and tactics would dominate. It is unclear why Darius accepted battle there. Some sources suggest he was maneuvered into it. Others suggest he was overconfident, believing sheer numbers would overwhelm the Macedonians regardless of terrain. Whatever the reason, the decision was fatal. Alexander deployed his army with the phalanx in the center and the companion cavalry on the right wing. He personally led the cavalry in a diagonal charge aimed at the left side of the Persian line, where Darius commanded from his chariot. The Macedonian phalanx engaged the Persian center. The fighting was brutal. The Persians held initially. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service pressed the Macedonian left and nearly broke through. But Alexander's charge was unstoppable. The companion cavalry smashed into the Persian left, carving through the ranks toward Darius. The Persian king, seeing Alexander cutting his way toward him, panicked and fled. The retreat became a rout. Persian soldiers, seeing their king abandon the field, broke and ran. The Macedonian cavalry pursued and slaughtered thousands. Darius escaped, but his army disintegrated. Alexander captured the Persian royal camp. Inside were Darius's mother, wife, and daughters. Also inside, the imperial treasury, gold and silver worth thousands of talents, enough to fund Alexander's campaign for years. It was a complete victory, but it was also revealing. Darius had fought bravely until Alexander threatened him personally. Then he had run. From a Persian perspective, this was not cowardice. It was pragmatism. The king was the empire. If Darius died, the empire would fracture. Retreating to fight another day was rational. From a Macedonian perspective, it was weakness. Alexander fought in the front lines. He took wounds. He risked death in every major battle. Darius commanded from the rear and fled when threatened. The contrast became propaganda. Alexander was the warrior king. Darius was the coward. It did not matter that Persian military tradition prioritized the king's survival. It mattered what the story became. After Issus, Darius sent letters to Alexander offering terms. He would cede all territory west of the Euphrates. He would pay a massive ransom for his family. He would form an alliance. Alexander refused. He did not want half the empire. He wanted all of it. Darius would try again. He would raise another army. He would meet Alexander at Gaugamela and try once more to stop the invasion. But Issus had changed the nature of the war. It was no longer a border conflict. It was existential. Alexander had defeated the Persian king in open battle. He had captured the royal family. He had taken enough treasure to become financially independent. The momentum had shifted. The Persians were no longer the unquestioned superpower. They were the empire trying not to collapse. And Alexander was the force driving the collapse forward, one battle at a time. After Issus, Alexander sent a letter to Darius. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. He addressed Darius not as a fellow king, but as a subject. He claimed all of Asia by right of conquest. He demanded that Darius approach him only as a supplicant. The tone was absolute. Submit or be destroyed. Darius did not submit. He retreated east to regroup and raise another army. Alexander did not pursue him. Not yet. Instead, he turned south. The Persian Empire controlled the eastern Mediterranean coast, Phoenicia, Judea, Egypt. These regions provided the empire's naval power. If Alexander was to secure his conquests, he needed to eliminate the Persian fleet. The way to do that was not to fight ships at sea. It was to capture the ports. So he marched down the coast, city by city, demanding surrender. Most surrendered. Sidon opened its gates. Byblos did the same. The cities had no loyalty to Persia. They were trading ports, concerned with commerce, not empire. Alexander offered them autonomy in exchange for submission. They accepted. Tyre did not. Tyre was an island city, half a mile offshore, with walls that rose 150 feet from the sea. It had never been taken by siege. It had the best navy in the eastern Mediterranean. Its merchants controlled trade routes from Greece to Mesopotamia. It was wealthy, fortified, and confident. When Alexander demanded entry to sacrifice at the temple of Heracles, the Tyrians refused. They offered to let him sacrifice at a temple on the mainland. Alexander took this as an insult. He decided to destroy them. The siege of Tyre lasted 7 months. Alexander could not assault the city from the sea. The Tyrian navy was too strong. So he built a causeway, a land bridge half a mile long, constructed from rubble and timber, extending from the mainland to the island. The Tyrians attacked the causeway with fire ships and artillery. They sank supply vessels. They killed workers. Alexander rebuilt. He brought in siege, engines. He constructed towers taller than the city walls. He assembled a fleet from the surrendered Phoenician cities and blockaded the island. The Tyrians held. For 7 months they resisted everything Alexander threw at them. The siege became a test of wills. Alexander had the resources to continue indefinitely. The Tyrians had the fortifications to hold indefinitely. But attrition favors the attacker. The causeway reached the walls. The siege engines battered the fortifications. The blockade cut off resupply. Macedonian soldiers breached the walls and poured into the city. The sack of Tyre was brutal. 8,000 Tyrians were killed. 30,000 were sold into slavery. 2,000 men of military age were crucified along the beach. Alexander made sure the executions were visible to every remaining city on the coast. It was not rage. It was calculation. Tyre had resisted for 7 months and cost Alexander time, money, and soldiers. He wanted every other city to understand that resistance was not just costly, it was suicidal. The message was received. The remaining Phoenician cities surrendered. Gaza, the last major fortress before Egypt, tried to hold out. Its commander, a eunuch named Bacchus, refused all terms. Alexander besieged Gaza. The city sat on a hill surrounded by desert. The walls were thick, the garrison was loyal. Bacchus believed he could outlast Alexander. He was wrong. Alexander brought in siege engines and mining equipment. He undermined the walls and breached them. Macedonian soldiers poured into the city. Bacchus was captured alive. According to one account, Alexander had him dragged behind a chariot around the city walls until he died, an echo of Achilles dragging Hector around Troy. The story may be apocryphal, but it fit the pattern. Alexander was modeling himself on mythological heroes, and those heroes were not known for mercy. Gaza fell. The entire eastern Mediterranean coast was now under Macedonian control. The Persian fleet had no ports. The naval threat was neutralized. Alexander's rear was secure. But the sieges had revealed something about Alexander that would define the rest of his reign. His treatment of conquered populations depended entirely on whether they had resisted. Cities that surrendered were treated well. They were granted autonomy, allowed to keep their governments, and often paid lower taxes than they had under Persian rule. Alexander presented himself as a liberator. He sacrificed at local temples. He respected local customs. Cities that resisted were obliterated, not just defeated, erased. The populations were killed or enslaved. The cities were leveled. The message was clear: cooperate and prosper, resist and die. This was not unusual for ancient warfare. What was unusual was the scale and the consistency. Alexander's capacity for violence was paired with a sophisticated understanding of propaganda. He wanted to be feared and admired simultaneously. It worked. As he marched toward Egypt, cities opened their gates before he arrived. Resistance collapsed. The Persian satrap of Egypt, a man named Macedonius, surrendered without a fight. Egypt welcomed Alexander as a liberator. The Persians had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, and the Egyptians hated them. Persian kings had desecrated Egyptian temples and imposed foreign gods. Alexander did the opposite. He sacrificed to Egyptian gods. He was crowned pharaoh in the traditional ceremonies. He visited the oracle at Siwa, deep in the Libyan desert, and emerged claiming the god Ammon had confirmed he was the son of Zeus. Whether Alexander believed this is unclear. Whether it mattered is also unclear. What mattered was the effect. In Egypt, divine kingship was normal. Pharaohs were gods. By claiming divine descent, Alexander was not being arrogant. He was conforming to Egyptian expectations. But to Greeks and Macedonians, claiming to be the son of a god was something else entirely. It was hubris. It was megalomania. It was the beginning of the transformation from king to something stranger. His soldiers grumbled. His generals stayed silent. Alexander ignored them. He had just secured the wealthiest province in the Persian Empire without a fight. He had neutralized the Persian navy. He had proven that cities that cooperated thrived, and cities that resisted burned. And he had begun to believe his own mythology. Egypt gave Alexander time to rest, resupply, and plan. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast and named it after himself, Alexandria. It would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. But he did not stay. He could not stay. Darius was raising another army in Mesopotamia. The war was not over. Alexander marched east toward the final confrontation. Egypt changed Alexander. Or perhaps it revealed what he had been becoming all along. He arrived in late 332 BCE as a conqueror, but was greeted as a liberator. The Persians had ruled Egypt harshly, suppressing local religion and extracting tribute. When Alexander entered Memphis, the ancient capital, the priests welcomed him as pharaoh. They performed the coronation rites. They declared him the son of Amun-Ra, the supreme god. In Egyptian theology, this was not metaphor. Pharaohs were gods incarnate. The distinction between the mortal king and the divine office did not exist. To rule Egypt was to be a god. Alexander accepted the title. Whether he believed it is the question that defines the rest of his life. Some historians argue he was simply adapting to local customs, playing the role expected of him to secure Egyptian loyalty. Others argue that the constant victories, the adulation of conquered populations, and his own education in Greek heroism had convinced him he was genuinely exceptional, chosen by the gods, descended from them, perhaps something more than human. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Alexander was too intelligent to literally believe he was immortal. But he also lived in a world where the line between great men and demigods was thin. Achilles had been half divine. Heracles had become a god. Why not Alexander? He traveled to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa, an oasis deep in the Libyan desert. The journey was dangerous, across 200 miles of desert, with no water sources except what you carried. Guides lost the route. Sandstorms erased landmarks. According to some accounts, crows guided them to the oasis. According to others, rain miraculously appeared. The sources exaggerate. But Alexander did reach Siwa, and he did consult the oracle. What the oracle told him remained secret. Alexander never publicly disclosed the prophecy, but when he emerged, he began referring to himself as the son of Zeus Ammon, not metaphorically, not as propaganda, as fact. His Macedonian companions were disturbed. Claiming divine descent was acceptable for poets and kings with centuries-old lineages. Claiming it while still alive and expecting people to worship you was something else. But Alexander did not care what they thought. He had defeated the Persian king in open battle. He had captured Egypt without a fight. He controlled a territory from Greece to the Nile. He had done things no one else had done. Why should he be judged by normal standards? This was the God-king temptation. The belief that exceptional success justified exceptional claims. The idea that the rules constraining ordinary people did not apply to him. It would grow worse. After Egypt, Alexander would adopt Persian royal dress. He would demand proskynesis, the Persian custom of prostration before the king. He would execute close companions for questioning his authority. He would marry multiple foreign princesses and claim to be uniting East and West under his divine rule. But in Egypt, it was still nascent. He was still the Macedonian king who fought in the front lines. He was still the general his soldiers loved. He was still capable of inspiring loyalty. Egypt gave him time to consolidate. He reorganized the administration, appointing both Greeks and Egyptians to positions of authority. He secured the grain supply, which would feed his army for the campaigns ahead. He founded Alexandria, a city designed to be a Greek cultural center on the Mediterranean coast. He spent months in Egypt. It was the longest he stayed anywhere after leaving Macedonia, and it gave him something he had not experienced since the invasion began: stability. But stability was not enough. Darius was raising another army in Mesopotamia. The Persian Empire still existed. The war was unfinished. In the spring of 331 BCE, Alexander marched out of Egypt, heading east toward the Euphrates. He left behind a peaceful, prosperous province and a growing sense that he was no longer just a king. He was becoming something the Greeks did not have a word for. A conqueror who treated empire not as administration but as destiny. A king who saw himself as the agent of divine will. A man who believed that the limits other people accepted did not apply to him. Egypt had welcomed this. The Egyptians were used to god-kings. They had been ruled by pharaohs for 3,000 years. Alexander fit their worldview perfectly. But the Macedonians and Greeks who followed him were not Egyptians. They believed in great men, yes. They believed in heroes descended from gods. But they did not believe in worshiping living kings. The tension between these worldviews would define the rest of Alexander's reign. He would try to blend Greek and Persian culture. He would try to create a new kind of kingship that transcended both traditions. He would fail, but not before remaking the political landscape of the ancient world. For now, In early 331 BCE, Alexander was at the height of his power. He controlled the richest parts of the Persian Empire. His army was experienced, loyal, and well supplied. His reputation terrified his enemies and inspired his allies. Darius was waiting for him in Mesopotamia with the largest army Persia could assemble. The final battle was coming. The battle that would decide whether the Persian Empire survived or whether Alexander would achieve what no one had thought possible. Egypt had given Alexander the resources and the confidence to continue. It had also given him the dangerous belief that he was chosen by the gods to reshape the world. He rode east with an army that trusted him and a certainty that nothing could stop him. He was probably right, but the cost of that certainty would be higher than anyone, including Alexander, could have imagined. Darius chose the battlefield. He chose the timing. He chose the terrain. He did everything right, and it did not matter. The armies met near the village of Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia on October 1st, 331 BCE. Darius had spent a year assembling the largest force the Persian Empire could field. Estimates range wildly, but even conservative counts suggest he commanded at least 200,000 soldiers, possibly far more. The force included contingents from across the empire. Persians and Medes formed the core. Bactrian and Scythian cavalry brought nomadic horse-archer tactics. Indian troops brought war elephants. Greek mercenaries provided heavy infantry. Darius had scythed chariots, war chariots with blades attached to the wheels, designed to cut through infantry formations. He had numerical superiority. He had chosen open, flat terrain that allowed him to deploy his full strength and negate the mobility advantages of Alexander's smaller force. He had prepared the ground, leveling it to make chariot charges more effective. Every advantage was his except one: Alexander. The Macedonian army numbered perhaps 50,000. They were outnumbered at least 4-1, possibly worse. But they were veterans. They had fought together for years. They knew Alexander would lead from the front. They knew the phalanx could hold against anything. They knew the companion cavalry could break any line. More importantly, they trusted the plan. Alexander did not attack immediately. He spent the night before the battle walking through the camp, inspecting positions, talking to soldiers. Some sources say he slept soundly. Others say he spent the night in his tent, studying maps and planning the engagement. At dawn, Darius deployed his army in a massive crescent formation, the wings extending to envelop the Macedonian flanks. The scythed chariots waited in the center. The cavalry massed on the wings. The infantry held the line. It was a formation designed to surround and crush. Alexander deployed in oblique order. His right wing advanced, his left refused. He placed the phalanx in the center with the companion cavalry on the right under his personal command. Parmenion commanded the left with the Thessalian cavalry. Light infantry and archers filled the gaps. Then he did something unexpected. He began marching his army diagonally across the battlefield, moving right, away from the prepared ground Darius had leveled. Darius reacted. He shifted his line to match Alexander's movement, trying to prevent the Macedonians from getting outside his encirclement. The Persian left wing extended farther, stretching the line. Alexander kept moving. Darius kept adjusting. The Persian line grew thinner. Then Alexander attacked. He unleashed the scythed chariots. They thundered toward the Macedonian phalanx. It should have been devastating, but the Macedonians had prepared. The phalanx opened lanes. The chariots rolled through harmlessly. their drivers killed by archers as they passed. The few that reached the infantry were stopped by sarissas. The chariot attack failed completely. Darius committed his cavalry. The wings closed in, trying to envelop the Macedonian flanks. Fighting erupted across the battlefield. The Macedonian left, under Parmenion, was pushed back. Persian cavalry broke through and reached the Macedonian baggage train. But Alexander saw what mattered. A gap had opened in the Persian line. As Darius's left wing extended to match Alexander's movement, the formation thinned. The Persian center separated from the left. It was a narrow gap, barely visible through the dust and chaos. But it was there. Alexander led the companion cavalry directly into it. The charge was perfect. The companions smashed through the gap and wheeled toward the Persian center, toward Darius himself. The Persian royal guard fought to protect their king. The Macedonians cut through them. Darius, commanding from his chariot, saw Alexander carving toward him through the melee. He saw his guards dying. He saw the Macedonian cavalry closing in, and he ran. For the second time, Darius fled the battlefield. His chariot raced east. His bodyguards followed. The Persian center, seeing their king retreat, collapsed. But the battle was not over. The Macedonian left was in trouble. Parmenion sent messengers to Alexander requesting support. Persian cavalry was threatening to encircle them completely. Alexander had a choice: pursue Darius and end the war, or turn back to save his left wing. He chose his army. He wheeled the companion cavalry around and smashed into the Persian forces attacking Parmenion. The impact broke the Persian attack. The cavalry scattered. The battle became a rout. Persian soldiers fled in every direction. The Macedonians pursued and killed thousands. Darius escaped. Alexander chased him for miles, but could not catch him. The Persian king disappeared into the interior of his empire, leaving behind his army, his treasury, and his credibility. Gaugamela was not just a military victory. It was the end of the Persian Empire as a functioning state. Alexander had defeated the imperial army, the largest force Persia could assemble. He had driven the king from the battlefield. He had proven that Persian numbers, Persian wealth, and Persian military tradition meant nothing against Macedonian discipline and Alexander's tactical brilliance. After Gaugamela, the empire fractured. Satraps stopped sending tribute to Darius. Some declared independence. Others waited to see who would win. Babylon opened its gates to Alexander without resistance. So did Susa. The Persian heartland lay open. Alexander marched into Mesopotamia as a conqueror, but he presented himself as something else, the legitimate successor to the Persian throne. He did not destroy the administrative systems. He appointed satraps. He respected local customs. He began wearing Persian royal dress, a decision that horrified his Macedonian officers but made sense if he intended to rule Persia, not just loot it. The question of what Alexander wanted had shifted. At the start of the invasion, the goal was revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece. Then it became conquest of the western satrapies. Then it became defeating Darius. Now, after Gaugamela, it became something else, replacing Persia entirely. Alexander did not want to destroy the empire. He wanted to become it. This was not what his Macedonian soldiers had signed up for. They had joined a campaign of revenge and plunder. They had expected to fight, win, and go home rich. Instead, Alexander was talking about ruling Asia. He was adopting Persian customs. He was demanding they bow to him like Persian subjects. The seeds of resentment were planted at Gaugamela. not because of the battle, everyone celebrated that, but because of what came after. The realization that Alexander had no intention of stopping, that the campaign would not end with Darius's defeat, that Alexander's ambitions had no limit. But in October 331 BCE, those concerns were muted by victory. The army had just won the most lopsided triumph in military history. They had broken the Persian Empire. They had captured unimaginable wealth. The plunder from Babylon and Susa made every soldier rich. Alexander stood at the center of the known world with no rival capable of stopping him. He was 30 years old. He had conquered half the earth in 4 years, and he was not finished. Persepolis burned for 5 days. The city was the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, built by Darius I and Xerxes to showcase imperial power. Its palaces rose on massive stone platforms. Its columns stood 60 feet tall. Its walls were covered in reliefs depicting tribute bearers from across the empire: Egyptians, Indians, Scythians, Bactrians, all bowing before the King of Kings. Alexander reached Persepolis in January 330 BCE. The city surrendered. The treasury was intact: 120,000 talents of gold and silver, more wealth than Alexander had seen in his entire life. He secured it, catalogued it, and prepared to move on. Then he burned the city. The sources disagree on why. Some claim it was deliberate revenge for the Persian sack of Athens 150 years earlier. Others say it happened during a drunken symposium, that a courtesan named Thais suggested burning the palaces, and Alexander, drunk and impulsive, agreed. Both versions could be true. Alexander was capable of cold calculation and sudden violence. He had burned cities before, but Persepolis was different. It was not a military target. It was a symbol. Burning it sent a message. The old empire was dead. Whatever Alexander was building, it would not be a continuation of Persian power. It would be something new. But new empires require centers, and Alexander's empire had none. He had conquered the territory from the Adriatic to the Hindu Kush. He controlled Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and the eastern satrapies, but he had no capital. He had no permanent administration. He ruled from wherever his army happened to be. This was not sustainable. Traditional empires had centers: Rome, Persepolis, Babylon. They had bureaucracies, tax systems, courts, and permanent institutions. Alexander had an army and a will. He appointed satraps to govern provinces, but he gave them little guidance. He demanded tribute, but did not establish consistent collection systems. He encouraged Greek settlement, but did not plan the cities. What he did was keep moving. After Persepolis, he marched east, chasing Darius. The Persian king had fled to the eastern provinces, trying to rally support and raise another army. But his authority had collapsed. The satraps no longer obeyed him. His generals began plotting. In the summer of 330 BCE, a group of Persian nobles led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, arrested Darius. They intended to use him as a bargaining chip, surrendered Darius to Alexander in exchange for retaining their positions. But Alexander moved too fast. When the conspirators realized he was close, they panicked and killed Darius, leaving his body on the side of the road. Alexander found him dying or already dead. The sources dramatize the moment. Alexander covering Darius with his cloak, vowing to avenge him. Whether this happened is unclear. What is clear is that Alexander used Darius's death politically. He declared himself the legitimate successor to the Persian throne. He gave Darius a royal burial. He hunted down the conspirators and executed them as traitors, not to Persia, but to Alexander's new empire. Bessus fled to Bactria and declared himself the new king of kings. Alexander pursued him. This was the turning point. Darius was dead. The Persian Empire was gone. Alexander controlled everything worth controlling. He could have stopped. He could have consolidated. He could have returned to Macedonia and ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. He did not stop. He marched into Bactria and Sogdiana, the mountainous regions of modern Afghanistan and Central Asia. These were the edge of the known world. Barren, hostile, populated by tribal warriors who had no interest in submitting to anyone. It took 3 years to subdue them. The fighting was brutal, not pitched battles but guerrilla warfare. Ambushes in mountain passes, sieges of fortified villages, populations that surrendered 1 month and rebelled the next. Alexander responded with massacres, resettlements, and the construction of fortified cities to hold the territory. It was the hardest fighting of the entire campaign, and it was, strategically, pointless. Bactria and Sogdiana added nothing to the empire. They were poor, remote, and impossible to govern. But Alexander had decided they belonged to him, so he took them. The army began to fracture. The veterans who had crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE were exhausted. They had been campaigning for 7 years. They were wealthy from plunder, but had no opportunity to enjoy it. They wanted to go home. Alexander refused to let them. He needed soldiers. The empire was too large to hold without constant military pressure. Letting the veterans leave would collapse the entire structure. So he kept them in the field, and he began changing. He adopted Persian customs fully now. He wore Persian royal robes. He demanded proskynesis, the ritual prostration before the king. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, to secure local alliances. He appointed Persians to high offices, giving them authority over Macedonian veterans. His Macedonian officers hated it. They had not fought for 7 years to bow to their king like Persian slaves. They had not conquered the world to watch Alexander become a Persian emperor. But Alexander did not care. He believed he was creating something new, a fusion of Greek and Persian culture, a universal empire ruled by a king who transcended national identity. His soldiers believed he was losing his mind. The tension exploded in a series of conspiracies and executions. Philotas, the commander of the companion cavalry and son of Parmenion, was accused of plotting against Alexander. He was tortured and executed. Parmenion, Alexander's most senior general, was assassinated on Alexander's orders to prevent retaliation. These were men who had fought beside Alexander since the beginning. Parmenion had been Philip's general. He had advised Alexander at every major battle, and Alexander had him killed based on suspicion. The executions sent a message. Loyalty to Alexander meant absolute submission. Questioning him was treason. The brotherhood of the early campaigns, the sense that Alexander was first among equals, was gone. He was the king. They were subjects, and the empire existed because he willed it. But empires without centers do not last. They require institutions, not just will. Alexander was 32 years old. He had conquered everything from Greece to Central Asia, and he had built nothing permanent to hold it. The empire existed in his person. When he died, it would die with him. But Alexander did not think about death. He thought about India. Clytus the Black saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River. He cut down a Persian nobleman who was about to kill Alexander. It was the defining act of loyalty, putting your body between your king and death. 8 years later, Alexander killed him. The murder happened at a drinking party in Samarkand in 328 BCE. Alexander and his officers were celebrating recent victories in Sogdiana. Wine flowed. Speeches were made. Someone began praising Alexander, comparing his achievements to those of the Greek heroes. Clitus objected. He said Alexander's victories belonged to the army, not just the king. He said Philip had been a greater general. He reminded everyone that he had saved Alexander's life. Alexander, drunk and furious, grabbed a spear and killed him. The sources describe Alexander's immediate horror. He collapsed beside the body. He wept. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing food and water. He called for Clitus, forgetting he was dead. His officers worried he would kill himself from grief, but he did not. He emerged, declared the killing justified because Clitus had insulted the king, and continued the campaign. The incident reveals something essential about Alexander in the later years. The line between genius and paranoia had blurred. The king who inspired devotion through personal courage and shared hardship had become a ruler who demanded absolute submission and executed those who questioned him. Clitus was not the first. He was not the last. Philotas, son of Parmenion, had been accused of conspiracy in 330 BCE. The evidence was thin, a drunk conversation overheard by a slave. But Philotas commanded the companion cavalry. He was powerful, popular, and had complained about Alexander's adoption of Persian customs. Alexander had him arrested, tortured, and executed. Then he sent assassins to murder Parmenion, Philotas's father, who was governing a province hundreds of miles away. Parmenion had served Philip for decades, and Alexander since the invasion began. He had commanded the left wing at Issus and Gaugamela. He was 65 years old and posed no threat. Alexander killed him anyway, because he might have sought revenge, because he was too powerful to leave alive, because Alexander no longer trusted anyone. The executions were strategic, but they revealed a shift in Alexander's psychology. He had always been ruthless with enemies. Now he was ruthless with friends. The men who had fought beside him since Macedonia were no longer brothers. They were potential threats. This was not irrational. Alexander had survived multiple assassination plots. His father had been murdered by a bodyguard. Macedonian kings ruled through force and fear, and challengers were common. Paranoia was, to some extent, justified, but it was also self-fulfilling. The more Alexander executed his officers, the more his officers feared him. The more they feared him, the more likely some would conspire. The more conspiracies appeared, the more Alexander believed everyone was plotting. The cycle fed itself. In 327 BCE, a group of royal pages, young nobles serving in Alexander's household, were accused of plotting to kill him. They were tortured and executed. One of them implicated his father, Callisthenes, a historian traveling with the army and a nephew of Aristotle. Callisthenes had publicly criticized Alexander's demand for proskynesis, arguing that Greeks did not bow to mortals. He had mocked the king's claim to divine descent. He was, by all accounts, annoying but not dangerous. Alexander had him arrested. The sources disagree on what happened next. Some say he was executed, others say he died in captivity. Either way, Alexander killed Aristotle's nephew for opposing royal protocol. The message was clear. No one was safe. not the sons of senior generals, not the relatives of Alexander's former teachers, not the men who had saved his life. Loyalty was no longer measured by past service. It was measured by present submission. The army noticed. The veterans who had followed Alexander from Macedonia were not the same men they had been. They were wealthy. They were exhausted. They had seen friends executed on suspicion. They had watched their king adopt foreign customs and demand worship. And they were still fighting, still marching, still dying in skirmishes on the edge of the world. The question was no longer whether Alexander would conquer the known world. The question was whether he would stop. By 327 BCE, Alexander controlled a territory from Greece to the Indus River. He had defeated every enemy who faced him. He had incorporated Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Central Asian cultures into his empire. He had founded cities, reorganized provinces, and spread Greek language and culture across 3 continents. But he had also executed his closest advisors, alienated his Macedonian officers, and turned the army into a machine that existed only to expand. The empire had no purpose except conquest, no goal except growth. Alexander had built a structure that required constant motion to avoid collapse. The moment he stopped, the contradictions would surface, the cultural tensions, the administrative chaos, the exhaustion of the soldiers. So he did not stop. He marched east, toward India, toward the edge of the maps. His soldiers followed because they had no choice. Desertion was death. Disobedience was execution. The only option was to keep marching and hope Alexander would eventually turn around. But Alexander gave no indication he ever would. The paranoia was part of it. The executions were part of it. But the core issue was simpler. Alexander believed he was destined to conquer the world, and he defined the world as wherever he had not yet reached. India was next. And after India, the sources suggest, he planned to turn west and conquer the Mediterranean, North Africa, and Europe. There was no end point, no moment when he would declare victory and stop. This was the tragedy of Alexander. He was the most successful conqueror in history, and he could not enjoy it. He could not rest. He could not govern what he had taken. He could only keep moving. And the men who followed him, who had believed in him, fought for him, bled for him, were beginning to realize that Alexander would lead them until they died or refused. The refusal was coming. In India, on the banks of a river whose name most of them could not pronounce, the army would stop marching. But in 327 BCE, they were still moving, still obeying, still hoping Alexander would find whatever he was looking for and let them go home. He never would. The Hydaspes River ran fast and deep, swollen by monsoon rains. On the far side, King Porus waited with an army that included 200 war elephants. Alexander had never fought elephants before. His horses feared them. His soldiers did not know how to counter them, but he attacked anyway. The battle was chaos. The Macedonians crossed the river at night, using thunder to cover the noise of their movement. Porus met them at dawn with his elephants leading the charge. The beasts trampled infantry and terrified cavalry. The fighting was brutal and close. Alexander won. He flanked Porus's army, isolated the elephants, and forced a retreat. Porus was captured, wounded, and defiant. Alexander, impressed by his courage, restored him as a client king and absorbed his territory into the empire. It was a masterful victory. It was also irrelevant. The army was done. For 9 years they had marched, from Macedonia to Egypt, from Egypt to Bactria, from Bactria to India. They had fought in deserts, mountains, and jungles. They had endured heat, disease, and wounds. They had watched friends die and commanders be executed. And now Alexander wanted to keep going. Beyond the Hydaspes lay the Ganges River and the Nanda Empire, rumored to field armies of hundreds of thousands. Alexander wanted to conquer them. He wanted to reach the Eastern Ocean, which Greek geographers believed encircled the world. He wanted to see where the earth ended. The soldiers did not care about the ocean. They cared about survival. The monsoon rains were relentless. The ground was mud. Disease spread through the camp. Wounds did not heal in the humidity. Men who had survived a decade of combat were dying from infections and fevers. And the rumors from the east were terrifying. The Nanda Empire was vast, wealthy, and militarized. The battles would be harder than anything they had faced. The rewards, if there were any, would not justify the cost. The veterans began to refuse, not openly, not yet, but in small ways. They moved slower. They grumbled louder. They stopped volunteering for dangerous assignments. Alexander pushed forward. He ordered the army to march east. They obeyed, but the mood was grim. At the Hyphasis River, the army stopped. The sources disagree on the exact sequence of events. Some say the soldiers mutinied outright. Others say the officers approached Alexander and told him the men would not continue. What is clear is that the army, for the first time in Alexander's reign, refused to obey. Alexander was furious. He summoned his officers and demanded explanations. They told him the truth. The soldiers were exhausted, sick, and terrified. They had been away from home for nearly a decade. They had wealth, but no way to enjoy it. They wanted to go back to Macedonia, to Greece, to their families. Alexander argued. He reminded them of their victories. He promised greater glory ahead. He appealed to their loyalty, their courage, their ambition. They did not move. For 3 days, Alexander stayed in his tent, refusing to speak to anyone. It was a tactic he had used before, withdrawing his presence, making his officers beg him to return. It had always worked. This time it did not. The soldiers did not beg. They waited. On the 3rd day, Alexander emerged. He performed sacrifices to determine whether the gods favored crossing the river. The omens, conveniently, were unfavorable. Alexander announced that the gods had commanded him to turn back. It was a face-saving lie. The gods had nothing to do with it. The army had simply refused to march farther. Alexander ordered 12 massive altars built on the banks of the Hyphasis, monuments to mark the farthest point of his campaign. Then he turned the army around and began the long march back. The return would be a disaster. The refusal at the Hyphasis was the moment Alexander's invincibility shattered. He had never lost a battle, but he had lost control of his army. The men who had followed him across the known world had finally said no. And Alexander, for all his genius and will, could not force them to change their minds. The decision to turn back was rational. The empire was enormous and ungovernable. The soldiers were exhausted. Pushing farther would have resulted in mutiny or collapse. Any other commander would have recognized this and been grateful for what they had achieved. But Alexander was not any other commander. He had built his identity on never stopping, never retreating, never accepting limits. The refusal was not just a tactical setback. It was a repudiation of everything he believed about himself. He would never fully recover. The return journey began in the fall of 326 BCE. Alexander divided the army. Part of it marched west along the Indus River. Alexander led a smaller force south, fighting riverine tribes and conquering cities that had no strategic value. At one siege, Alexander personally scaled the walls with only 3 companions. Arrow pierced his lung. He collapsed, bleeding. His soldiers, thinking he was dead, stormed the city in a frenzy of grief and rage. They massacred the population. Alexander survived, but barely. He spent weeks recovering, too weak to walk. When he finally appeared before the army to prove he was alive, they wept with relief. But the incident revealed his recklessness. He was not fighting for territory anymore. He was fighting to prove he was still invincible, still chosen by the gods, still Alexander. It was desperation disguised as courage. By the time the army reached the coast, the monsoon season had ended. Alexander ordered a part of the army to return by sea. The rest would march west through the Gedrosian Desert, modern Baluchistan, and reunite in Persia. It was a catastrophic decision. The desert was barren, waterless, and hostile. Thousands of soldiers, camp followers, and animals died from thirst, heat, and starvation. The sources claim that more men died crossing the Gedrosian Desert than in all of Alexander's battles combined. When the survivors staggered into Persia in 325 BCE, they were skeletal, traumatized, and broken. The great army that had conquered the Persian Empire was a shadow of itself, and Alexander, watching them arrive, realized that he had pushed too far, that the machine he had built required fuel he no longer had. But he did not stop. He still had plans. He still believed in his destiny. He just did not have much time left. The Gedrosian Desert killed more of Alexander's army than Darius ever had. It was not supposed to be this way. The plan was simple. While the fleet under Nearchus sailed along the coast, Alexander would march the army west through Gedrosia, resupplying the ships and securing the route back to Persia. But the desert was worse than anyone anticipated. Water sources marked on maps did not exist. Supply caches did not arrive. The heat was unbearable. The terrain was sand, rock, and thorn bushes. Soldiers collapsed from dehydration. Pack animals died and were butchered for food. Followers and camp attendants, women, children, merchants who had traveled with the army for years, were abandoned when they could not keep pace. The column stretched for miles, disintegrating as the strong pushed forward and the weak fell behind. The sources claim Alexander shared the hardship, refusing water when there was not enough for everyone. One account describes soldiers finding a small amount of water and bringing it to him in a helmet. Alexander poured it into the sand rather than drink while others suffered. It was leadership. It was also inadequate. The march was a strategic blunder. Alexander had chosen the route to emulate Cyrus the Great, who had supposedly crossed Gedrosia successfully. But Cyrus had lost most of his army, too. Alexander repeated the mistake out of pride. When the survivors reached Carmania in late 325 BCE, perhaps a quarter of the force that had entered the desert was still alive. Thousands were dead. The army was shattered. And Alexander's response was not to mourn or reorganize. It was to hold a festival. He declared a celebration of the campaign's successes. Wine flowed. Soldiers were rewarded. Promotions were announced. It was a performance of victory at a moment of catastrophic loss. The veterans understood the message. Their suffering did not matter. What mattered was Alexander's narrative, and the narrative was that the campaign had been a triumph. It had not. The invasion of India had gained nothing of value. The return had been a disaster. The empire was too large to govern. Rebellions were breaking out in the eastern provinces. Satraps were embezzling funds and ignoring orders. Alexander dealt with the rebellions by executing the offending governors. He did not reform the administrative system. He did not consolidate. He simply killed the individuals who had failed and appointed replacements. It was governance by terror. It kept the empire functional in the short term, but it created a culture where no one trusted anyone. Satraps governed brutally because they knew failure meant death. Officers competed for Alexander's favor because proximity to power was the only safety. The army watched all of this and realized Alexander had not changed. He had not learned from the refusal at the hyphasis. He had not accepted limits. He was still the same man, driven by the same compulsions, unable to stop. And they were exhausted. The veterans who had crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE were unrecognizable. They were in their 30s and 40s now, wealthy but broken. They had fought for 10 years. They had been promised they could go home. Instead, they were still marching. Alexander did allow some discharges. The oldest and most wounded veterans were sent back to Macedonia with honors and pensions. But this caused its own problems. The departing soldiers resented being sent away. The remaining soldiers resented being kept. No decision satisfied anyone. Meanwhile, Alexander continued his policy of cultural fusion. He held a mass wedding at Susa in 324 BCE, marrying 90 Macedonian officers to Persian noblewomen. He married 2 Persian princesses himself, Statira, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of the previous Persian king. The symbolism was clear. Greek and Persian would merge into a single ruling class. The empire would transcend nationalism. The or Macedonian officers hated it. They saw it as betrayal. They had conquered Persia. Now they were being forced to marry into it, to dilute their identity, to become something else. But they obeyed. Because refusal meant execution. Because Alexander was still the king. Because they had no choice. The army was fracturing along cultural lines. The Macedonian and Greek veterans despised the Persian and Asian recruits Alexander had incorporated. The new soldiers were untrained, undisciplined, and unproven. But Alexander treated them as equals, which the veterans saw as an insult. At Opis, in 324 BCE, the tension exploded. Alexander announced he was discharging more veterans and incorporating Persian soldiers into the Macedonian units. The soldiers mutinied. They shouted that Alexander should take his Persian troops and conquer the world without them. They mocked his divine pretensions. They demanded to be released. Alexander, in a rage, leaped into the crowd and personally arrested the ringleaders. He had 13 men executed on the spot. Then he locked himself in his quarters and refused to see anyone. For 2 days, the army panicked. They had not expected Alexander to react so violently. They had not expected executions. They begged for forgiveness. Alexander emerged and gave a speech. He reminded them of everything they had accomplished together. He called them ungrateful. He said if they wanted to leave, they should go. But they would go as exiles, abandoning their king. The soldiers wept. They begged him to take them back. Alexander relented. He held a feast of reconciliation. The mutiny ended. But the relationship between Alexander and his army had changed permanently. They no longer followed him out of loyalty or ambition. They followed him because they feared what would happen if they did not. The brotherhood of the early campaigns was gone. What remained was a king who demanded absolute obedience, and an army that obeyed because they had no alternative. Alexander had won. He had crushed the mutiny. He had reasserted control. But he ruled an empire held together by fear, exhaustion, and the unstoppable momentum of his will. The moment that will faltered, the structure would collapse. That moment was coming. Alexander returned to Babylon in the spring of 323 BCE. He was 32 years old and planning his next campaign. Arabia. That was the target. He had assembled a fleet, recruited soldiers, and mapped the coastline. After Arabia, perhaps the western Mediterranean, Carthage, Italy, Sicily, perhaps north toward the Black Sea and Scythia. The sources suggest he wanted to circumnavigate Africa. There was always another target, always another horizon. Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire, and it was not enough. He was planning invasions that would take decades, restructuring an empire that was already too large to govern. But he never launched the Arabian campaign. In June, after a long night of drinking with his officers, Alexander developed a fever. At first, it seemed minor. Fevers were common. The heat, the travel, the stress, any of these could cause illness. Alexander continued working. He reviewed plans, met with envoys, and performed religious ceremonies. But the fever did not break. It worsened. Within days, Alexander could not stand. Within a week, he could not speak clearly. His officers gathered around his bed, watching the most powerful man on earth deteriorate. The cause of death is disputed. Some ancient sources claim poison, a conspiracy by Macedonian generals who feared his growing megalomania. Others suggest malaria, typhoid fever, or complications from old wounds and years of physical abuse. Modern scholars debate liver failure from alcoholism, West Nile virus, or bacterial infection. The truth is unknowable. What matters is that Alexander, who had survived wounds that should have killed him, who had crossed deserts and mountains, who had defeated every enemy, died in a palace in Babylon from a disease no one could name. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander died. He was conscious until near the end. His officers filed past his bed, and he acknowledged each one with a gesture. When asked who should inherit the empire, he allegedly replied, "The strongest." It was not a succession plan. It was an invitation to civil war. Alexander left no clear heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the child was not yet born. His half-brother Aristeus was mentally unfit to rule. His generals were ambitious and commanded their own armies. The empire fractured immediately. Within weeks, his generals began dividing the territory. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus took Mesopotamia and Persia. Antigonus claimed Anatolia. Lysimachus took Thrace. The fighting would last 40 years and kill everyone involved. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was murdered in a power struggle in Macedonia. His wife Roxana and his son were executed. His half-brother was killed. Every member of his immediate family died violently within 15 years of his death. The empire he had built disappeared. Not slowly, quickly. The administrative systems collapsed. The cultural fusion he had attempted evaporated. The cities he had founded remained, but the idea of a unified empire ruled from Babylon vanished. What remained was the legend. Alexander became a figure of mythology within a generation of his death. The historians who wrote about him, Arrian, Plutarch, Curtius, were working from lost sources and oral tradition. They turned him into a hero, a villain, a demigod, a cautionary tale. every conqueror who came after studied Alexander. Julius Caesar wept when he saw a statue of Alexander, because he had accomplished nothing at the age Alexander had conquered the world. Augustus carried a seal ring with Alexander's image. Trajan tried to emulate his eastern campaigns. Napoleon read biographies of Alexander and imagined himself a successor. The pattern repeated. Every ambitious general believed they could succeed where Alexander had failed. They believed they could conquer without collapsing. They believed they could build empires that would last. They were all wrong. Because Alexander had not built an empire. He had built a military campaign that never ended. His genius was tactical, not administrative. He could win battles, but he could not create institutions. He could inspire soldiers, but he could not delegate authority without paranoia. The empire existed in his person. When he died, it died. Babylon had been the center of the Persian Empire for centuries. It had libraries, palaces, and traditions. Alexander could have made it his capital. He could have settled, governed, built. Instead, he had stayed just long enough to plan another invasion. And then he had died. The irony is complete. Alexander spent his entire adult life moving forward, conquering, expanding, refusing to stop. And the moment he paused, the moment he stayed in one place long enough to rest, he died. History does not offer clear morals, but it offers patterns. Alexander's pattern was unsustainable. Conquest as an end in itself, ambition without limits, the belief that exceptional individuals are not bound by normal constraints, all of it led to the same place. Brilliant success followed by immediate collapse. He had done what no one else had done. He had rewritten the map of the ancient world. He had spread Greek culture across 3 continents. He had proven that a single individual, given enough will and enough violence, could reshape civilization. But he had also proven that will alone cannot sustain an empire, that momentum without structure collapses, that even the greatest conqueror is mortal. Babylon buried Alexander in a golden coffin. Ptolemy later stole the body and took it to Egypt, where it was displayed in Alexandria for centuries before disappearing into history. The empire fragmented. The generals fought. The soldiers went home or died in the civil wars. The cities Alexander had founded became Greek cultural centers, but they were not his cities anymore. They belonged to whoever could hold them. Alexander had conquered the world and owned none of it. He had built an empire and watched it disintegrate before he died. He had achieved immortality through legend, but failed at everything permanent. And yet, his influence endures. Not because of what he built, but because of what he proved possible. One man, in 10 years, had changed everything. And the world has never forgotten. Every empire that followed tried to avoid becoming Alexander. None of them succeeded. The Roman generals who invaded Parthia failed, just as Alexander's successors had failed to hold the eastern provinces. The Mongol Empire fragmented when Genghis Khan's grandsons divided the territory. Napoleon conquered Europe and died in exile. The British Empire expanded until it collapsed under its own weight. The pattern is consistent: rapid conquest, overextension, fragmentation. Alexander created the template. Not intentionally. He did not plan to be a cautionary tale, but his life demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of imperial ambition. The possibilities are obvious. With enough military genius, enough will, and enough ruthlessness, a single individual can conquer enormous territory in a short time. Alexander did it in 10 years. Genghis Khan did it in 20. The mechanics of conquest are replicable. The limits are subtler. Empires require institutions, bureaucracies, legal systems, succession mechanisms, cultural coherence. Conquest does not create these. It destroys them. The conqueror smashes existing structures and replaces them with nothing except military occupation. This works as long as the conqueror is alive and active. Alexander could hold the empire because he was personally present, moving from crisis to crisis, executing dissidents, rewarding loyalty, projecting invincibility. But the moment he stopped, the moment he died, the empire evaporated, because it had no foundation beyond his person. Later, empires tried to solve this. Rome built legal codes and civic institutions. The caliphates created religious legitimacy. The Mongols established trade networks and administrative systems. But all of them eventually faced the same problem. Empires built through conquest are unstable. The skills required to take territory are not the skills required to govern it. Alexander had the former. He lacked the latter. And he did not live long enough to learn. The question historians ask is whether he could have. If Alexander had lived to 40, to 50, to 60, could he have transitioned from conqueror to administrator? Could he have built institutions, trained successors, and created a stable state? Probably not, because everything in his personality pointed toward expansion, not consolidation. He was 20 when he became king. He was 32 when he died. In those 12 years, he never stopped moving. Every pause was temporary. Every peace was preparation for the next war. He did not know how to be a peacetime king. He only knew how to conquer. This is the Alexander pattern: brilliant, unstoppable, unsustainable. It repeats because ambition is common and wisdom is rare. Every generation produces individuals who believe they are exceptional, who believe the rules do not apply to them, who believe they can succeed where others have failed. Some of them are genuinely exceptional. Alexander was. Genghis Khan was. Napoleon was. But exceptionalism does not exempt you from limits. It just makes the collapse more spectacular. The tragedy is that Alexander almost understood this. In his final years, he tried to create stability. He held mass weddings to fuse Greek and Persian elites. He founded cities designed to be cultural and administrative centers. He incorporated foreign soldiers into Macedonian units. But he did it through force, not persuasion. The Macedonians resented the Persian marriages. The new cities were military outposts, not organic communities. The foreign soldiers were resented by the veterans. Alexander tried to build a multi-ethnic empire, but he did it in a way that alienated everyone. The Greeks saw him as a tyrant. The Persians saw him as a conqueror. The Macedonians saw him as a foreigner. He succeeded militarily and failed politically. And when he died, the political failure destroyed everything the military success had created. The legacy of Alexander is not his empire. It is the idea of conquest as destiny. He taught the world that empires could be built quickly, that nothing was impossible, that individual brilliance could overcome any obstacle. This idea inspired generations of leaders. It also killed most of them, because the idea is half true. You can conquer quickly, you cannot sustain quickly. The speed that makes conquest possible is the same speed that makes governance impossible. Alexander never learned this. He died believing he was building something permanent, planning invasions that would take decades, confident that his empire would outlast him. It lasted months, but the legend lasted millennia. and the legend is more powerful than the empire ever was. People remember Alexander not because of what he built, but because of what he dared. He crossed into Asia with nothing and carved out the largest empire the world had ever seen. He fought in the front lines. He took wounds that should have killed him. He refused to stop, refused to compromise, refused to accept limits. This is why he endures. Not because he succeeded, he failed at everything permanent, but because he tried, because he showed that one person with enough will and enough violence could change the world. The cost was absolute. The empire collapsed. His family was murdered. His generals destroyed each other. The cultures he tried to fuse remained separate. The cities he founded forgot his name, but the pattern remained. The belief that greatness justifies risk, the conviction that limits are for ordinary people, the idea that some individuals are destined to reshape history. It is a seductive idea. It is also a dangerous one. Because Alexander proved you could conquer the world. He also proved you could not keep it.